And can you discuss, what's going on with Palestinian-based industry and how it's affected by the occupation and the back-to-back system, and what are the implications for people living there and their industrial development?
Well, one of the problems with the checkpoint system is that it favors Israeli industry over Palestinian industry. So if you look at the budget of the Palestinian Authority, the vast majority of the money that the Palestinian Authority receives is not from its own industry or taxation, but from the donor, the international donor community. And so then you have to ask the question, well, why is that? And the answer is because the Palestinian industry just can't develop or thrive. There's so much uncertainty there that the business community is unwilling to invest. But even when they're there, the checkpoint system favors Israeli goods. So Israeli goods don't have to go through the Israeli checkpoint system. Palestinian goods do. Palestinian goods have to go even to go within the West Bank, have to go through a series of checkpoints in which their goods are unloaded from one truck and reloaded onto another truck and so on and so forth. And so that obviously adds cost to both the production and the distribution of goods. Israeli agriculture gets huge subsidies. So much of the produce that Palestinians consume is Israeli they're produced by Israelis. Most of it in the settlements as well. So, so the whole system is designed to favor Israeli goods and not Palestinian goods, which is why you have this lopsided economy.
And you said that the BDS movement is picking up steam, having some successes. Can you give examples of that?
It is. It's picking up steam. More and more international artists are unwilling to perform in Israel. More academics are refusing to come to Israel and do a term or whatever, go on sabbatical there. There have been boycotts of goods. There have been corporations around the world that have been targeted, including security corporations that have been targeted, that are now mandated to not do business with the Israeli occupation. For such a young boycott movement, there have been a number of key successes that people are beginning to think twice about doing business with Israel. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
And how has it affected Israeli policy, Israeli government?
Oh, this is, the boycott is, to me, one of the #1 issues that the Israelis are irate about, because it goes to the very heart of Israel. Israel has always wanted to be accepted, recognized, and accepted for all of the human rights abuses that it commits. So despite everything that it does, it wants to have that recognition. Now the boycott movement takes that away. And that is why there's been so much energy against the boycott movement, whether it's in the form of pinkwashing, whether it's in the form of greenwashing, trying to make Israel seem more environmentally.
Pinkwashing.
Yes, pinkwashing is a way of demonstrating that Israel is a gay-friendly society, which it's not. And therefore it's a country that people should be supporting. That greenwashing is a way of demonstrating that Israel is environmentally friendly, which it's not, and therefore a country that should be supported. The latest is film washing, trying to demonstrate that Israelis are actually very introspective, and their films, through their films, there's a lot of criticism. It's very minor, and so they're trying to do that. There's a number of different mechanisms that they've used. So those are 3. But they've also done other things. They've tried to host large-scale concerts inside Israel, which just a few weeks ago flopped, and so on. So they're because they couldn't get the artists that they wanted. They couldn't get artists to come to Israel. So they invest a lot of effort at trying to make Israel look good, whether in the form of books, in the form of different organizations in the United States that try to promote Israel and all of the great things it does. Yes, but not just brand Israel. They try to show that just how cutting edge Israel is. All to say, you can ignore the human rights abuses. Israel's pretty cutting edge. And so that's a lot of effort on the one side. But then on the other side, there's also been a lot of effort on the part of Israel to prosecute anybody who calls for a boycott against Israel. So currently, there's a piece of legislation that is now working its way through the courts that is essentially trying to criminalize anybody who calls for criminalize action of Palestinians or Israelis who are calling for boycotts against Israel.
And we haven't talked about the water issue?
Yeah, I mean, water, I'm not so familiar with. I know a little bit about, but it's again another attempt at greenwashing, is this idea that Israel has done such great things with water. But when you scratch the surface a bit, you realize that Israelis consume practically 9 times more than Palestinians do, because they're allocated more. Israelis have swimming pools. Palestinians kind of don't. Israelis don't have water shortages. Palestinians do.
Why is that?
Because the water is allocated to Israel and Israeli settlements and Israeli agriculture, and Palestinians have to just make do. So for example, in the Gaza Strip, where there isn't a water shortage, but there's a water quality shortage, a shortage of quality water, the areas around the Gaza Strip don't have a problem, but Palestinians inside Gaza, only, I think it's between 5 to 10% of it is actually fit for human consumption. So you can just imagine what the rest of it is like. And when I lived there, I remember just the smell of the water, and the water smelled like salt water all the time. And my hair would fall out when I took a shower. And then in the West Bank, because Israel controls the distribution, there are some places just this past summer where in one of the refugee camps in the West Bank, they went more than 70 days without getting water. So you can just imagine what life is like for people who don't have water for 70 days.
And then the Palestinians are drinking bottled water that's made?
Yes.
By Israeli companies?
That's right. Using their own wells, yes.
Can you?
Yeah. So because of such water shortages, Palestinians spend huge amounts of money to buy water that the Israelis bottle out of their springs.
Okay. So what would you advise people in the United States to be doing on this issue?
Oh, where do I begin? First, be pushing for boycotts of Israel, whether that's at your university, whether it's you yourself and your neighbors, whether it's your municipality, your city, to be boycotting Israeli, not just Israeli goods, but those companies that do business with Israel, such as Caterpillar. I'm not sure why Caterpillar snow removal equipment is allowed.
So what do the Israelis do with Caterpillar bulldozers?
They use bulldozers to bulldoze Palestinian houses, and an American was one of the victims of a Caterpillar bulldozer. So I would encourage people to really push the boycott. Again, whether it's in their own city, their own town, at their university, boycotting Israeli goods, boycotting the goods of those companies that do business with Israel. I'd be pushing for pensions to divest from Israel. I would push for the United States not to give so much money to Israel, or any money for that matter. When you look at the per capita income of Israelis and compare it to some states in the United States, and you realize that there are some states in the United States that are poorer, and yet so much money, $3 billion every year, is going to Israel. You're left wondering, well, why can't that money just be put to use at home. And I would be encouraging Americans to push for the end of U.S. taxpayer money to go to Israel. They don't need it. They're using it to destroy Palestinian homes, to commit human rights abuses against Palestine and against Palestinians. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a Palestinian who doesn't see the link between what Israel's doing and the United States' facilitation of it. I'd be pushing for Israel's isolation on a much more international stage. I'd be pushing for their isolation at universities, so that there aren't these, cross-university programs, such as taking place at Cornell, between Cornell and the Israeli University, the Technion. And the reason is that each of the Israeli universities has some tie to the Israeli army. In information, all of the scientific information that they use in terms of the military, military intelligence is developed in Israel and used against Palestinians in the West Bank. So, these are just some of the things. Then of course, there are other things. It's still not clear to me why Americans don't protest en masse when they come to visit the country and they're treated like garbage when they're in the airport. These are just things that it just don't make sense to me. Knowing what I know.
Treated like garbage?
Well, if you come into Israel and to get into Palestine, you have to go through an Israeli border crossing, whether it's via Jordan, Egypt, or into the Israeli airport. And on the way out, I've heard story after story after story of Americans being treated terribly, being strip searched, with their possessions taken away, etc., all because they dissent. And it's not clear to me why the U.S. government doesn't do anything about it. Or in the case of Palestinian Americans who are denied entry, it's not clear to me why the U.S. government isn't doing anything. Actually, it is clear to me. It's because there is such a power relationship between the two, and nobody's really trying to challenge that relationship.
So when did you first learn about the Holocaust, and how did that information affect you in your life?
I think I was in the 6th or 7th grade when I first learned about the Holocaust in Canada. And, it didn't really affect my life in the sense that it was, at that point in time, such a long time ago, and it was described to us, it was taught to us via film and books, and obviously you pick up the tragedy of it, and you learn the lesson of that we should be learning lessons.
And as you got older, did you process it differently, or is it just part of history? Or?
Well, as I got older, I processed it differently only because I started to meet people whose families were, grandparents were survivors of the Holocaust, and I began to recognize that it was quite a deep. It wasn't just the people who were affected, but there were generations who were affected.
And did it alter your sort of understanding of how this whole conflict emerged, or have any impact on it, or?
It altered it only in the sense that it made me realize that that there was a lot of trauma that's involved. And when you go through a traumatic experience, you end up, or at least what I saw was that the Israelis ended up justifying a lot of what they did because of this trauma and not learning the lesson from it. So in other words, it was, nothing can compare to the Holocaust because the Holocaust was such a horrific experience, and it was. But then the lessons weren't really taken from that. In other words, that as awful and horrific an experience it was, rather than learning from that experience and saying, we're not going to commit human rights abuses against people, we're not going to dispossess people, it ended up being, well, not the opposite. It was like, well, because all of this happened to us, therefore we are justified in doing what we've done. And it wasn't just for the generation of the people that the people who survived the Holocaust, but this has gone on for generations, to the point where even where I see today a lot of the many of the apologists for Israel and Israel's activity point to the Holocaust as being a reason why they are entitled to do what they're doing, rather than a reason not to do what they're doing.
Okay. So you had talked about having optimism.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about your optimism?
I'm definitely optimistic. And I don't know if it's naive optimism, but I'm definitely optimistic. And the reason is I feel that this can't go on for much longer. People's eyes are beginning to open to what Israel's doing. And I don't think you can really justify any longer the continued denial of freedom or lack of equality. And I see it on US campuses. I see it when I read the pages of the newspaper, where you're now beginning to read critical voices. Even something as basic as Chuck Hagel's appointment, which, Chuck Hagel's no friend of the Palestinians. But the fact that he voiced a little bit of criticism against Israel, and it's now being blown out of proportion to the point where, I just hear so many Americans saying to me, why does the Secretary of Defense have to pledge allegiance to a foreign entity? That just doesn't make any sense to me. So I'm optimistic, I really am. I don't think that that it's going to unravel overnight. I'm not so naive as to believe that this relationship between the United States government and Israel is going to change anytime soon. But I do think that Americans are changing. And not just Americans, I think people around the world are changing. The boycott movement's picking up. The people around the world are beginning to recognize that this is wrong. And Israel's lies can only go so far.
So you talked about overplaying their hand?
They really have. They've overplayed their hand, especially in their actions in Gaza. It doesn't make sense to me or to anybody else how Israel can justify dropping bombs on refugee camps. That just doesn't make sense. To a defenseless civilian population, it doesn't make sense.
So you think that things are going to change? Yeah.
They are changing. They are changing. Snail's pace, but they're changing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And where do you call home?
Palestine. Yeah, Palestine is my home.
Talk more about that.
I made a decision in 2000 to live there, and I could have backed out at the beginning, within months of my arrival. I didn't. Something kept me there. 2001, after my one-year commitment was up, I could have left. I didn't. So I stay for a reason. I'm not sure what the reason is, I have to be honest, but it is a place I call home.
Any particular part of it, or the whole place?
No, the whole place.
Because it's interesting, when last time I asked you that, you told me you didn't know.
I didn't know, yeah. I didn't know at the time because I've been traveling a lot. I've spent the past 3 years traveling back and forth. But no, that place is my home. I've come to realize that I definitely have a strong home connection to Canada. And that's where I was born, that's where I was raised, that's where my parents are from. It's the country that took in my parents. There's a lot of attachment there. And so I definitely, Canada's home. But where my current home is Palestine. And it's whether I'm living in Canada or whether I'm living in Palestine or whether I'm living in Boston, I have this real sense that my home is Palestine. And I could be in Canada at that same point in time.
And have your mother and father been able to reconnect, or they still don't want to have anything?
No, they have. They've reconnected. They've reconnected a great deal. They've reconnected in two ways. So in part, they are tourists who come to visit. They visit me. They visit the country that they were born in and raised in. But they visit it like tourists because they didn't really see it when they were kids. So they come as tourists, but then they also come as as people who are from that place. And so it's hard for me to describe, but you just have to take a look at the way that they operate. For example, my father, while he's in Canada, first thing he does in the morning, turns on the computer, and he listens to the radio from Nazareth. That is, he knows what's going on in Nazareth every morning, every day. And so while he's in Canada, his home is Palestine. And so they relate to it as Palestinians, as citizens, as this is their homeland. But then while they're there, they're tourists. And it's, I think, in large part because they left when they were so young.
And how do they feel having a daughter who's gone back and retraced their steps in some way?
They, mixed. At the beginning, they weren't happy about it. I think they're happier now. And I think that they've come to a place where they're feeling at ease and at peace with it. With themselves and with me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And anything else you want to say?
No, I think that's it.